Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the OTT.X Wednesday webinar series. On behalf of all of us at OTT.X, I want to thank you for joining us today to the series where we are delighted to be bringing you insightful, thought-provoking presentations across a broad spectrum of OTT-related topics from thought leaders across our industry. Viewers today have a dizzying array of choices, as we all know, for content and how they'll experience it. In the face of increasing complexity, massive competition, streaming services are experimenting and evolving their content, business models, branding, and more to remain relevant in viewers' lives. To help us unpack this ever-shifting, seeming morass that is streaming, we are excited to have with us today James Muldrow, Vice President of Product Management for Comscore, for a comprehensive overview of how streaming models are changing, what's driving the shift, and the role social media has in winning over viewers in the current media landscape. James Muldrow is the Vice President of Product Management for the Digital Audience suite of Comscore products. Since joining Comscore, James has overseen the development of innovative digital offerings such as industry-leading unduplicated measurement between owned and operated and distributed content audiences. Prior to joining Comscore, James led teams for a diverse sets of products in the semiconductor, healthcare, and online publishing industries. Before getting started, I also want to thank Whip Media for their continued support of OTT.X's Wednesday webinar series, helping make it possible for us to bring amazing content like this to you. Thank you, Whip Media. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to James to get things kicked off. James, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Eric. All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great Wednesday. I'm going to share my screen now, and we will get started. So thanks for joining today. I wanted to take some time to talk about really how streaming has evolved and really the approach to getting customers, to winning customers, and retaining them. The agenda for today that I want to walk through is first, I want to really make sure that everyone is clear about what the state of streaming is as far as adoption trends, but then also talk about some of the top streaming services that are there. I know we as consumers definitely probably know of who the top 4 or 5 are. We might actually purchase them, but there are a lot of different avenues in which we can consume streaming, and the focus here is definitely to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then gonna stop for a couple of minutes for any questions, and then we'll dive into some emerging trends and social media and how that's actually coupling pretty nicely with how streaming engagement plays today. To kick things off, I always like to talk about streaming in the sense of what are we talking about when we use terms like OTT and CTV. They're often used as synonyms, but recently, as of last year, the MRC, the Media Rating Council, which is a very important industry body for us in the measurement space, they helped to provide some guidelines when it comes to officially redefining or defining what is OTT versus what is CTV. And we'll use these definitions within this presentation. So whenever I'm talking about CTV, I'm actually referring to delivery of digital video to televisions via internet connected devices. A long way to say watching TV or watching a television set, and the source of the content is something from the internet. OTT, on the other hand, is really more of an all-encompassing view of digital video, and it's about streaming content that could be consumed anywhere, whether it's your desktop, your mobile device, or a CTV one. And we try to make these things distinct because when we often talk about what we are measuring, it's important for us to have that sort of clear boundary between a device versus a type of content when we have an ever-expanding ecosystem of devices and services, and we have a ever increasing need to have some kind of standards around that when we talk about this as an industry. So those are just some of the terms that I'm going to be using, and I'm generally going to be talking about CTV today, so consumption of streaming on a television. To dive into the current state of streaming, when we think about connected TV devices, there's certainly been a surge since 2020, but that's sustained itself. So when we think about the number of CTV households, so households in the US that are streaming content on CTV devices, that's increased about 34%. It was in the mid 60 million household range, but now it's top of almost 86% or 86 million households today. So that's a 34% increase. And then not only are the number of households increasing, but the total number of hours are also increasing. They're increasing faster than the total number of households, indicating that there's just more consumption on a per household basis now than there was in the past. That makes sense. We have a lot more that we could choose from and a lot more opportunities to stream on CTV devices. But that's up 84% when we just think of just number of total hours being streamed. And when we look at this from the overarching perspective, that really points to the fact that streaming is not a trend, it's a reality. As I mentioned, we're registering roughly 86 million households that have both Wi-Fi and are streaming on CTV. That's up from last year by about 5 million households. But then the number of time spent per household is also increasing, up 19% from just a year ago. So about 122 hours, so a little more than 5 days of streaming activity within a given month. And the average viewing days is roughly 221 days per month, meaning that if we took the 30-month window of a 30-day month, we would be streaming on a CTV device pretty much 2/3 of the days during the month. And that's up 3 days from March of last year. So the ability to have choices and the ability to exercise our viewing as a consumer really is prevalent in the number of streaming services that we have, but also the amount that we're actually streaming. We were pretty steady when it comes to streaming services watched per household for a couple of years, but in the last year it's increased quite a bit. And we think that ComScore that is really an indicator of just the amount of choices that we have. If we take the exercise to think about the number of streaming services that are available to us. In the past, there were a more limited number. There were specific streaming services that often had a great deal of content really concentrated within them, whether it's a original content or catalog content that we may have wanted to watch from past viewing. But now there's been really a divergence of that type of viewing where a lot of the catalogs have moved to dedicated streaming services where they're now being hosted. When we think about how Netflix has had certain content migrated away from them to either Peacock or HBO Max because the owners of those catalogs have ended their particular contracts with Netflix. So that gives the opportunity for the catalogs to be available on other streaming services and for people to want to engage with those services. There have also been a number of services that have been introduced that are free, and they can garner a large increase in viewership pretty quickly if there's no expectation of payment. Or if there is an expectation of payment, viewership can also be increased when there's the ability to do ad-supported payments, which are lower than, say, non-ad supported payments when you have a purely subscriber-based revenue stream. And what we've seen when we look at that there's also been an interesting influence when it comes to cable subscriptions and the role of how linear television and the viewing of that through vMVPDs or the classic cable subscription has changed the amount of subscriber base, but it hasn't changed it to the extreme detriment that I think there was a lot of fear of or a lot of questions about several years ago. When we look at the number of subscribers versus number of cord cutters being a household that used to subscribe to cable but no longer does, and now does subscribe to a different virtual MVPD. Those two are really shifting back and forth between each other versus cord nevers, uh, which are households that have not had a subscription in the last 5 years for cable or satellite. Those number of households is actually going down, and we believe that that's because there's sort of this sustainable transitory period between a cable subscriber and a cord cutter, with the cable companies and the satellite companies executing well on marketing strategies that are using bundling, whether that means an internet service with a TV subscription for a lower price, or offering premium views of streaming services with a subscription, or just the fact that they themselves are now producing their own apps where you can view similar content and DVR it via any of the devices you have outside the home, like on your mobile device or desktop. This has allowed sort of subscriber base to be either retained or migrate to cord cutting, but then gained back over time. This is usually occurring with large promotional deals. You can pay a very low price for 1 or 2 years, leave, and then come back 1 or 2 years later and again pay a very low price, which allows you to be a subscriber, then a cord cutter, then a subscriber again, rather than going into the cord never bucket. So this has been an interesting take that we've observed. And when we think about the reason why this has been able to have this sort of sustainability type of cycle, first we wanted to look at really what are the options out there for everyone. And the options have been becoming more numerous. When we look at total Wi-Fi homes, roughly 80% of them are doing some kind of streaming on a CTV device. And that's grown quite a bit since 2019 up until now. That's 14 percentage points of Wi-Fi households. So more households that have Wi-Fi are now doing streaming to begin with. And if we look at a specific service, I'm using Netflix as an example here, there's only a small gap between those that are doing viewing on a CTV device versus that are doing viewing on any other device. There's roughly a 10% gap if you were looking at Netflix alone, of a Netflix viewing household, of that household, those households that view Netflix on a CTV device versus just Netflix generally, which means they could view Netflix on a desktop or a mobile device. So most of the viewing is being done on a CTV device. And for a lot of these services, including what we are calling, what we used to think of as the top 5, the big 5, and now it's a top 6. Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime Video, Hulu, HBO Max, and Disney Plus, all of these services are in at least a penetration of greater than 35%. So more than 1 out of every 3 households, at least 1 of every 3 households has one of these services that are streaming with them on a CTV device. And in particular, I wanted to highlight HBO Max, which has, since they began to offer an ad-supported version of their subscription, have grown tremendously in the last year. HBO Max used to be outside of the top 5. It has since, from a subscriber base, increased quite a bit and moved actually into the top 5, displacing Disney Plus moving it to the top 6. And although the number of viewing hours per household is still less than all the other of the top 6, this is really an example of how a change in strategy when it comes to subscriber acquisition and subscriber retention can increase at least penetration when it comes to having your brand available and being streaming within the households. When we look at, say, the overall hours watched, that is still continuing to be dominated by a couple of players, namely Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, and Amazon. That was true in 2021. It's true in 2022 as well. But the number of overall hours has increased in that time frame, meaning the pie is overall bigger. So there is more opportunity still for smaller services to garner a large amount of hours watched, which means there's the opportunity for greater amount of ad revenue if it's an ad-supported services, or greater amount of subscription-based services if there's a distinction between ad-supported and non-ad-supported. So that is something that we certainly have noted, that because the pie is getting bigger, the pie has gotten bigger, the opportunities for revenue still have are still on the positive. And then if we look at just the top 6 that I talked about versus the other top 6 just for video, and this is a distinction for total being anything that I could do on a CTV. That can include video or audio. I can listen to Spotify or Pandora or iHeart on my television. But if I'm just looking at video, again, the top 6 really dominate, but amongst the outside the top 6, there's a great deal of parity when it comes to the hours watched amongst the streaming services. And some of these are vMVPDs like a Sling or an Xfinity Stream, and some of them are devoted to specific types of content like an ESPN or a Discovery Plus or a Paramount Plus. So very, very similar types of viewing when you get outside the top 6, but a clear distinction between that top level of streaming service versus the rest. Diving specifically into Netflix's audience, because I want to talk about how overlaps and the amount of choices can really affect viewing. We looked at amongst the top competitive streaming services with Netflix, what was the overlap? Amazon, YouTube have roughly a 66% overlap between the two, meaning about 2/3 of the Netflix audience also has a subscription or is streaming Amazon Video or is streaming YouTube. This is interesting because this does show that who are the alternatives that households have already chosen, but also who are the alternatives or options that households are beginning to choose more. And the biggest winner in the last year has been Peacock. Peacock being a free service, so it's possible to watch Peacock without paying anything. That is an ad-supported view of the world, but it's possible to pay to not see ads as well on Peacock. But the fact that it is a free service really has allowed really a trial of the service amongst the Netflix audience, which by nature is paying for the service. This is a interesting overlap because this does present the opportunity to gain viewership without an economic burden necessarily on the consumer, but then provides the opportunity for the consumer to see the content in its full capacity and potentially subscribe to that or other services in the future. Peacock, for example, is often bundled with cable subscriptions. Xfinity does have the option to have Peacock Premium, or it does give Peacock Premium, so the non-ad supported version of it when you subscribe to Xfinity. So this gives an option for additional revenue from different streams that may just use Peacock as a gateway. And then we think about the overall competition for someone like a Netflix, which of course has had a great deal of press around how their subscriber base is doing and what are the prospects for that subscriber base in the future. There's a great deal of overlap across the top 6. 82% of the Netflix audience has at least one of these other services in the top 6. And If we look at outside the top 6, 83% of them do have that. These are both increases from a year ago. So there's more overlap. So there's more trial. There's greater opportunities for viewing different content, and potentially the greater need to have content that is compelling in order to retain subscribers. So that's something that really we've looked at. I want to shift gears slightly to talk about model analysis, and then we'll take a couple of questions. So when we think about the model itself of how consumption is being done with streaming services, the non-ad supported model versus the ad supported model, they're very much on par with each other as far as the number of households that are consuming one of these types of services. That wasn't true in the past. If we looked at a couple of years ago, the non-ad supported subscriber base for households was significantly larger than the ad supported one, but the growth of ad supported has been faster than non-ad supported, making them sort of similar now. And when I say non-ad supported, I'm talking about the Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, where you're only paying. There isn't an ad-supported version of them. And when I say ad-supported, it means there's the potential for an ad-supported version. So the type of lower cost and the free services have been able to, at least from a adoption perspective for households, been a faster way to grow a subscriber base in the last couple of years. And it's the same thing when we're looking at the time spent. So the time spent viewing these types of services on CTV devices, that has also increased. The time spent has actually been pretty similar in both cases throughout the run of what the data we're looking at over the last couple of years, with ad supported being only slightly higher than non-ad supported at this point. So there's a great deal of time being spent with AVODs versus SVODs, and there is a great deal of parity when it comes to them, both on the number of households as well as the viewing. But some of these types of households do consume different content based off of whether they have a cable subscription versus whether they don't have a cable subscription. And we want to take a look at that, meaning households that have a vMVPD. And when I say vMVPD, I'm referring to both pure streaming vMVPDs like a YouTube TV or a Sling, as well as the virtual versions of an existing subscription like an Xfinity stream or a Spectrum TV associated with the Charter subscription. When we looked at households that have a vMVPD, as in they stream linear TV content via one of the various apps that they could, those households have on average about 7.3 streaming services per household. If you recall, the average was about 5.4. They also stream more. Like they spend more time watching their CTV connected viewing, 177 versus 122. And about 56% of these households are cordless, meaning that they are not tied to a cable subscription. So most of the viewing when you have a vMVPD is being done in a cordless household, as opposed to one that has a cable subscription. So these particular households do seem to have greater activity, likely because they are streaming a lot of linear television that is available to them and available to watch on a continuous basis, and generally in a household that is larger, that has more people in it, that may want to watch different things at a different point in time. But when we think about the number of overall devices, because if you think about households, there's a view of a television, but there are likely multiple devices in which that television could be plugged into, and also multiple devices that could exist in the household to begin with. So when we think about how device consumption is changing, the biggest winner when we think about all CTV devices has been smart TVs. So if we look at all smart all CTV devices, the number of households, that's grown from 72 to around 86 million. That's the total pie that I talked about at the beginning. But if we look at how the streaming is being done, a lot of it's being done with streaming boxes. Those are your Rokus and Apple TVs and Chromecasts. But in the last couple of years, more and more is being done on the smart TV itself. Generally because the TVs that are available, whether it's a Samsung, a TCL, a Vizio, these have a lot more capabilities from an app perspective than they may have had in the past. And that allows for the need or lessens the need at times for an actual box or a streaming device to be connected to the TV. For example, Samsung TVs have Apple TV Plus on them. You don't need to have an Apple TV box in order to watch content that's from Apple TV Plus. What we also notice is that because of the rise, or given the rise of smart TVs, we likely have seen declines on other devices that were previously used for streaming, namely gaming consoles. They're still being used heavily for gaming, but the use of the console as the source of the app in which you are watching video content connected to your TV has lessened, likely because the TV itself is able to do this more than it has in the past. And then quickly, before I start open up for a couple of questions, I wanted to share just how the breakdown of these smart TVs, which is the fastest growing of these devices, has been changing from just an OEM, a market share perspective. Samsung is still very much the dominant force, but TCL, Vizio, they've been able to increase their market shares largely based off of the availability of the devices themselves, their distribution network, but also the partnerships that both of these have done when it comes to being able to have content, say, with Roku or Fire TV. All right, with that, I'm going to pause. And if we want to answer any questions, or if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those.
Yeah, thanks a lot, James. I want to invite our audience, please drop your questions into the Q&A bin. We'd love to hear from you on the fascinating information, analysis and data that you've shared so far, James. It's really great stuff. A few things I'm kind of surprised about. I'm sure other folks have their own thoughts on this, but first of all, the ability for traditional cable operators to retain subscribers. You know, we're all presented with data and the trends on cord cutting and cord nevering. But I mean, I wonder why that is. I was thinking as you're going through that, maybe it's, you know, as folks start to compare the cost of building their own bundles with the ever increasing number of services that they want to subscribe to with Disney and HBO and Hulu and Amazon and everybody else that's getting into it. And you have to pay for an internet service provider, it adds up to a bunch of money, and maybe you're not really saving that much. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, and that particular side that you're probably referring to, we've gotten a lot of questions about that, because I think a lot of the assumption was that cable was going down, cord cutting was going to go up, and nevering was going to go up. But cord cutting did go up, subscribers stayed the same, cable stayed the same, and nevering went down. And a lot of it is because of the economics of it. The ability for bundling to happen, as you described, Eric, exists, but because both the cost of individual services like that have gone up in the last couple of years, if you recall, that, you know, a lot of these services used to be cheaper than they are today. And now, as you continue to have a larger and larger bundle of these services, they begin to mirror the cost that you might have been having for cable in the past. But the cable companies, they also have generally internet service with them. They can bundle those, they can offer it to you at a promotional rate and be economically similar to the custom bundle that you might have created without their services. And because these are possibilities for at least promotional periods, you can come back on board as a cable subscriber for a year or two and take your promotional rate and then cut them off again. And then you can come back a year or two and then cut them off again. It's creating this sort of, in a way, sustainable cycle that you can have. And that's why we've thought, why we feel we've observed cord nevers going down, but the cord cutters are going up, because they're sort of just trading places with subscribers in that way.
Yeah, it's something, I guess, we'll see where obviously where it goes, but it seems a little bit like and across a lot of the metrics that you're sharing, that there's a lot of gravity towards the larger companies, the Comcast, the Charters, and the content providers, and the folks that have a lot of money and can invest in it. And I wonder if that's, we're going to end up kind of right back where we were, with basically just a new technology, over the top streaming, but the folks that are going to be delivering it, and the way it's delivered, might end up being very similar to what we're used to.
Yes, and consolidation, acquisitions, mergers, those have been a part of television's past. It seems to be starting to emerge in streaming as well.
Mhm.
If we think about the fact that Discovery and Warner Media, they're now one, and there's certainly an idea that the fact that there exists an HBO Max and a Discovery Plus today may not be the case going forward, given that they're now one entity. And can the catalogs combine to create one single service, rather than having two that you could pay for in theory right now? The same is true with how the bundling has occurred between Hulu and ESPN and Disney Plus, all of which are generally under the arm of the umbrella of the Walt Disney Company.
Yeah, and you also have to kind of wonder about the economics of these businesses themselves. Netflix is, we haven't really talked too much in the last 5 years or so about Netflix's economics, and bottom line is it's not great. They're borrowing tons and tons of money to make content, and they're not profitable. But yet, the darlings of the industry, until very recently, there's a little bit of a reality check there. But I wonder about Disney Plus and Apple and Peacock and HBO Max. How, at what point is there a kind of it's time to pay the piper, and you actually have to be profitable, make business work in your business, and that's, of course, remains to be seen. We have a really interesting question from someone. I'd like to get to this if we could. James, we have time. With the oscillation between cord cutting and cable subscription, do you observe any differences in windowing time between TV shows and movies?
That's a great question. We have seen definitely that the windowing does exist, but to the extent that it's different between TV shows versus movies, we have not observed that. Typically, I think one of the hallmarks of some of the streaming services is that TV shows and movies start to look very similar to each other, in the sense of both the quality and also the sustainability of them. Movies, certainly, they've had an interesting journey in the last couple of years with the pandemic on whether they should be released in theaters at all, or if they go directly to streaming, which does affect how we want to view them, and if we want to view them in the same way that we do TV shows. But we have not seen a large distinction between those, at least at the moment.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sure there's a ton more that we could talk about, but I want to get you back on track to finish up your presentation. And there's time, we'll take some more questions at the end.
Cool. All right. So getting back to the deck, now I'm going to talk about some of the emerging trends that we've seen, as well as the impact of social. All right. The first trend that I want to talk about is gaming. Remember, I said that gaming consoles were on the decline when it came to streaming services. That was as a conduit for video streaming, as opposed to gaming consoles being used for gaming. When we think about video game streaming, though, there is a major player in that, and that is Twitch. Twitch has their usage has actually surged quite a bit in the last several years. They were up 88% as far as total minutes. When we're just looking at total digitals here, so desktop and mobile, and a little bit of CTV for total minutes. And this has been interesting because obviously people aren't just playing games; they're engaging with the gaming community, and that can mean watching others play games, talking about games. But Twitch has taken its role in that community and really tried to expand it even further, because if you go to Twitch today, there's more than just gaming. There are any number of categories of live streaming that are available. There are streamers that talk about TV shows. There are streamers that talk about games. There are streamers that talk about music. And as being part of the now Amazon umbrella for Twitch, that gives them the opportunity to have a great deal of cross promotion with anything that is available on Prime Video. It can be available on a Twitch channel as well. So this is an example of a trend that we've definitely seen when it comes to live streaming, that began really focused on gaming, but it now seems to be branching out to beyond that. Another trend that we definitely have noticed is not just about all the what is being watched, but who is doing the watching. And we wanted to look at the audiences that were doing the watching, specifically when it came to diversity. And when I'm talking about diversity here, I'm referring to household members that have a particular racial or ethnic background, in this case, African American, Asian American Indian, or Hispanic. And when we looked at households that have members that are of these groups, they have gone from roughly 25 million households that have members of this group to nearly 35 million in the last 4 years. So a big increase, a lot more of viewership in these households. And the overall share of the total households has increased as well, indicating that these diverse audiences are consuming or starting to consume on CTV devices faster than other groups. And I'm speaking about diverse audiences here in the aggregate, but we see the same trends if we break out the individual components as well. So we look at the African American viewership, that from a household perspective, that has increased by 24%, the same with the Asian households, American Indians, Hispanics, and anyone identifying themselves as other, meaning they do not identify as a single one of these, but they may identify as multiple. So this is interesting when we talk about the adoption and who is doing the adoption. It seems to be sort of across the board that diverse audiences are garnering a great deal of attention from both the streaming perspectives, and they are doing the streaming, but also from the services that may want to present content that is particularly attractive to these audiences. We looked at a single snapshot of just March data to look to see if there was any kind of that type of trend. And what we looked at is the number of viewing days per household. So not necessarily the number of hours or the number of households, but how many days per month were viewing these services. And we definitely found some over-indexing services, meaning they are more likely for these particular audiences to be viewing more days of the month. Fubo and was a particularly interesting one for both the African American and the Hispanic community, or the households that have those members in them. They overindex a lot in March. The way that we were looking at this is there was a great deal of content that has been added for, say, Fubo, in regard to sporting events, in particular for that are attractive to, or that over-index for these audiences. And that seems to have contributed to the fact that these audiences are viewing these services more often, or is in more days of the month than others. The same with some of these other services, where we're seeing the programming or the content seems to mirror the increase or the over-indexing of the streaming viewing days. So being able to have both content that is attractive to particular audiences and sustaining that over time seems to be a great way for a subscriber base to grow for a given service and really cement it as a go-to for a particular audience. And because there is the opportunity just for an explosion of content as far as the variety of content available, then that gives a particular service an opportunity to either be niche if they want to be, or to be diverse and have a great deal of variety and still retain a large audience. And then I want to jump into social media, and I want to close with how social media really is fueling some of the streaming engagement that we see. At ComScore, we have a great deal of social assets that we have available to us, and we have fielded a very large social survey, first to talk about what social media people were viewing, but also what are they looking for when it comes to streaming content. Most of the respondents actually were looking for clips. When they were using social media, they wanted to go onto Facebook or Instagram, and they wanted to see clips or something that's related to the show, because it was either an interesting meme or an interesting scene from a particular episode. That was our first indicator that really social media can be a driver to engagement. If there is a particular moment in a show or a particular moment in a movie that has the ability to be placed onto social media and can be viral. This is where our memes come from. When we looked at how social media really plays a role in creating a buzz in the air for a particular piece of content, that was something that we've also seen is certainly prevalent. When we looked at just looking at the first part of the year, from January to May, there were over 600 million actions taken across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram that were related to shows, to some kind of streaming content. The same when we look at the overall audience that's trying to engage, the number of views when we're talking about video or actions like liking or sharing. And these all seem to be pretty overwhelmingly positive. Is in the actions being taken, we looked at Facebook specifically, the actions being taken related to shows were generally likes and loves and laughs and wows. Very few of them, or if we just looking at the pie chart, if you think about a a positive versus something that is less positive, something that's more negative, like sad or angry, those only take up around 1.6% of the number of actions that are actually taken. So most of the actions generally that you see on social media, at least on Facebook, when it comes to TV shows, are generally positive. Now, sentiment from the comments perspective may be different, but the action to be able to look at it is generally positive. And when we look at the shows that are really getting the most actions, Netflix, they are dominating as far as the top five. Four of the top five are related to Netflix shows, whether it's Stranger Things or Bridgerton or Umbrella Academy. Only Obi-Wan Kenobi from Disney Plus has been able to sustain in the top five just as far as the number of actions. Again, these are like shares, comments of things of those nature. And we found that interesting because the overall content that is available on all of the various streaming services is certainly eligible for any kind of social media interaction, but Netflix seems to have garnered that. And probably one of the main reasons why Disney Plus was able to break into this top five with Obi-Wan Kenobi is because there is obviously it centers around a legacy character from a huge franchise that, at least for the actor, you haven't seen on screen playing this role live action in nearly 2 decades. So that garners a great deal of attention and a great deal of interaction when it comes to social. And when we looked at social interaction for specific shows, and we did this for This Is Us, who just ended its 6th-season run as a show, there was a great deal of convergence when it came to actions and viewing. If you look at these charts, the orange are the actions on social, and the blue are the number of viewers on desktop, mobile, and CTV. Looking at, in this case specifically, This Is Us on NBC and Hulu. And whether it's for a season premiere, which is generally happening in the later part of the year in Q3, Q4, or when it comes to the final couple of episodes, which really started happening, which happened this year in the first quarter, there's a tremendous correlation between actions and viewing, meaning that we expect that if we look at larger sets of these, and this is something that we're studying at ComScore, is action a leading indicator, or is it truly a corollary for viewing? And can we actually look at that engagement on social and compare it to engagement on actual video? We found very interesting that these mirror each other so quickly or so closely. And then finally with social, we also wanted to understand, is there a purchase incidence amongst the various users of these particular social media platforms? And this is the same survey that I talked about. We had thousands of respondents, and we basically just asked them about which social media they use, but also which streaming services their household purchases. Amazon Video was certainly the winner as far as the number of respondents that were in a household that purchased it. So it seems like a lot of Amazon households use these particular social platforms a great deal. And the list goes down between Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu, and HBO Max, but we found that interesting because the fact that that particular streaming services, paid streaming services, can have a large presence or a large crossover with the audience on particular social media platforms gives the content for those services a way to be interacted with, to be spoken about, and to be shared in order to gain or perpetuate the audience that may already exist. If Amazon, for example, has a new show that they want to promote, their social media seems to be a great avenue for that. And at least with Amazon, they could sort of pick any one of these, and the audience there, at least that subscribes to their services, would be an engager and aware of it. So those are some of the emerging trends that we had with social media. And I wanted to close now before we have one more round of questions in just putting streaming consumption in context. I talk about streaming a lot, and that's from an internet connected view of the world, but there's an entire linear TV view of the world. This is the traditional uh, cable box that you don't need an internet connection to view. That's still a really big part of viewing hours within the US. Streaming has certainly increased quite a bit. If we look back at 2019, it was much more of an 85-15 split between linear and streaming, and now it's a lot closer to 70-30. So streaming's basically doubled its share in the last few years. And will this trend continue? Probably, because there's more opportunity for the linear functionality to happen on streaming. And this is reinforced by some of the earlier comments that I was making about how cable subscriptions can exist, but they have apps where you could watch that via outside the home or outside of the actual cable box that's there, which would effectively move it from a linear TV hour to a streaming hour. So that's not to say that the content of television or the producers of the content are seeing drop-offs, but how that is being consumed is changing. And that's true when we look at CTV, but there's also a lot of activity that's still on desktop and still on mobile. We walk around with our phones all the time, so that gives us opportunities to always have something available to us if we want to do video streaming. The same thing with our computers. They've been pretty stable. They haven't changed a great deal while streaming on CTV has increased, but the fact that streaming on CTV has increased without majorly dampening desktop and mobile is still an indication that we're spending more time doing video streaming, and we're just doing it on different devices. That's also true overall when we're just looking at live TV. So live TV that's being looked at through a set-top box versus DVR versus CTV. The DVR has gone down. The live TV has been pretty stable, but the CTV has gone up. Typically because CTV can now support both the live and the DVR functionality, and that's an opportunity for just a shifting of which method there's being used to consume the content. So the key takeaways for today, there was a big 5 that's now a big 6 with the rise of HBO Max. So those are really a group of services that are garnering a lot of the subscriber base and a lot of the hours. Ad-supported streaming services, they're being adopted at a faster rate than purely subscription-based, and that's signaling a shift in the market and a shift in mindset potentially for even a non-ad-supported service like a Disney Plus or Netflix, both of which have expressed that they likely will go forward with an ad-supported version of their products. The average household, they're viewing 5.4 streaming services per month, and that's an increase over last year. And Netflix in particular, they've got a large overlap with the other streaming services, so more opportunity for mixing and matching. Diverse audiences, those are being viewed as certainly a source of potential subscriber bases, new audiences that weren't there before. They now make up over 40% of the streaming consumption on these devices. And then social media, it mirrors viewership very closely. And so actions on social media and the virility of anything on social media has an effect on the viewing on streaming. So thank you very much for chatting or listening to me today. I am happy to take any other questions in the last minute that we've got here.
Hey, thanks a lot, James. Tremendous presentation, and hope that we can have you back sometime. We are pretty much at time right here, but really opened up a lot of great information, and I think spurred a lot of ideas and thoughts from all of us. So as I mentioned, we'd love to have you back. Comscore has been a fantastic partners and members of OTT.X. I'm really grateful for your support today with our webinar. With that, I think we're going to close things out, just given the where we are in time. But I want to let everybody know that this presentation was recorded, so you can share it with your friends and colleagues, and have another chance to watch it. It's going to be out on the OTT.X website at OTT.X.org, along with a whole lot of other videos and presentations from our online events over the last year plus. I want to bring everybody's attention to some great events that we have coming up in the OTT.X sphere. First off, we're going to be in New York City in just a few weeks on July 13th for the OTT.X Summer Salon. Salons are a fantastic opportunity to network with the OTT community, have open discussions on all things OTT, and strengthen the collective voice of this growing industry, as well as share some appetizers and cocktails if you'd like. The event is exclusive to OTT.X members, and this one's going to take place from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time at the Globe Pub in New York City. Space is limited, so you want to reserve your spot quickly before they're all gone, because they're first come, first serve. Next up on August 31st, we're going to be kicking off the OTT.X Summit Market Conference and more. Two-day event takes place at Los Angeles' Skirball Cultural Center, and will facilitate business discussions between content buyers and sellers, as well as a host of thought-provoking presentations and panels about the OTT industry. So you don't want to miss that. There's so much more going on, including our next Wednesday webinar series, where WIP Media will be presenting their annual streaming survey, How Do Subscribers Feel About Their Platforms? So do jump on with this next Wednesday. You can find out and register for this and all our events at the OTT.X website. I'm going to go ahead and drop the link to that right into the chat right now, so y'all can access that very quickly from here. So why not go out there right now? That concludes our presentation for today. I want to thank everybody once again for joining us, and thank you to Comscore, James, and to WIP Media for making all of this possible today. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Eric.